Trump is now saying, as of today, I'm not really sure that the ceasefire deal is going to hold through all three phases. So that is either one, maybe the reason why he didn't, during his inaugural address, take any credit for it, because he's like, well, if this doesn't work, I actually don't want my name put on it. Or number two, and I'd like your opinion on this, does it mean that he's talking to the Israeli leaders and they're telling him it's not going to hold, so he's claiming he's not confident now? How do you see that?
Well, he certainly took credit in the Capitol Arena, the parade, the address there. Steve Witkoff, who was his envoy, the one who's credited with going to Israel and getting Netanyahu to agree to this deal, gave a whole speech there, and so that, if you look at the Capital One Arena function, the centerpiece was Israel. As well also too, the spectacle of Donald Trump.
So I'm afraid I literally didn't even see that such.
Yeah,
what happened? The gist of it.
And I don't blame people for not watching it. I mean, because the idea was that were going to have this thing, this pep rally or whatever, and particularly to replace the parade. If people are familiar with American inaugurations, after the inauguration, there's always a big parade that goes in front of the White House. So they did it inside Capital One Arena, which is which is where the Washington basketball and hockey teams play and everything else. 20,000 seat venue, and they did have a small parade. They had a bunch of bands come through and everything, but primarily what occurred was families of hostages came marching in, and they all had these yellow scarves around their neck, symbolizing that yellow ribbon, bring them home. Many of them were holding signs with pictures on them. And they were brought in, and they were brought up onto the stage in front of the seats where Trump and his family and his cabinet were all sitting. And they stood there and they shook Trump's hand, and then Trump came down and he gave about a 40 or 45-minute address. This is following Witkoff's 10 or 15-minute long speech. And the entire time that Trump is talking, and this is an off-script Trump speech. It wasn't like the inauguration address where he read it. This was him just kind of doing his thing. And, so 40, 45 minutes, they stood behind him as the backdrop. And then what they also had up on that stage was a desk where Trump went over and signed the executive orders, or some of the executive orders. And the hostages' families remained there the entire time. So they were used as a backdrop, as a prop throughout the whole thing. So certainly the many of us watching the inauguration felt that, wow, Trump really breezed over Israel-Palestine. He barely mentioned. He spoke about Panama more than he did, right? And we, spoke about that for a bit. And then you go to this, and you see the focus on Israel, the focus on the families, the focus on Donald Trump as being the great deal maker who's bringing back the families of these people. Their loved ones are coming back because of me. And they all thanked him, of course, on camera, right? He had all of that. Okay, so what does this mean for Israel and Palestine? Well, it certainly shows that there's no conception whatsoever that there's going to be any type of good faith, honest deal making by the Trump administration. That whatever occurred with Netanyahu and Trump in terms of getting the ceasefire deal through had this in mind, that Trump was going to be able to have what Chris Hedges called a presidential inauguration bombing pause. And that certainly is what we saw there on display in front of 20,000 people at the Capital One Arena. For the Israelis, I think, Danny, there's benefits operationally, strategically, and politically to the ceasefire. The idea that they're able to reset their forces, to refit their forces. Their aircraft have been operating for 15 months now nonstop. They need that downtime. They need this operational pause. It also allows them to shift forces. And of course, as what we're seeing then is the genocide in Gaza coming into a ceasefire, we see very, very serious and important operations beginning by the IDF in the West Bank, particularly in Jenin. They're calling it Operation Iron Wall.
I wonder if you can go into a little bit more depth on that. We're going to talk about General Halabi in a minute. Yeah. But there has been so much focus on these negotiations for the Gaza Strip and all that there's been very little public reporting on the West Bank. But right. You have said that there's actually a lot going on in the West Bank. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I was just there in November, and there's a tremendous amount going, all preparation for the annexation. I think we can look back now and look at Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, Syria, all as supporting efforts for the main effort of the annexation of the West Bank. I think what you've seen is or what we do know is that the Israelis had the best opportunity they've had in 50 years to achieve that annexation. That annexation of the West Bank has always been their priority. The West Bank has always been the most important thing. We might think the Iranians are the most important thing for the Israelis, the people in Gaza, Hezbollah. No, absolutely not. Those are all supporting to the main effort of the West Bank. So what you've seen is over the last year, of course, the turning loose of settlers to do as they want, the dominance of the Israeli army in terms of terrorizing the people, as well as murdering about 850 Palestinians, hundreds of them children, since October 7th of last year. And that's just the beginning. You have to look at what they've been doing as shaping operations, setting themselves up to begin the process of annexation. And I think the annexation that we'll see that may be beginning now, particularly this operation in Jenin, the idea being is that the rural areas, the rural parts of West Bank will be ethnically cleansed. That what we saw occur in Gaza will be repeated in the West Bank, especially in the smaller villages, the smaller towns and villages, what are called Area C. And then the larger cities will be isolated. And you've seen that in the last year. You've seen the Israelis have always strangled the West Bank since they began occupying it. They've always cut off roads, cut off communications, shut down electricity when they want, turn off the water, not allow them to have water, right? They've always strangled the West Bank. But in the last year, they've really tightened that. And so you hear from the Palestinians more about road closures, more about how difficult it is to get places. So physically separating the Palestinians from one another so that they can't mutually reinforce each other, right?
Now, I saw a headline just a week ago that said actually the Palestinian Authority had been taking a lot of operations and actions basically in support of the Israeli side against the Palestinians. What's going on with that?
So the Palestinian Authority has always been the collaborators that allow for the occupation to control the West Bank. So the Palestinian Authority, which was created as part of the Oslo process back in 1993, always meant to be temporary, but of course never was temporary. Well, became permanent because the Israelis control the whole situation. The Palestinian Authority, they have to show themselves as necessary. They have to show themselves as reasonable. They have to show themselves as someone that the Israelis can rely upon, right? So what has occurred in the last couple months is that Jenin, which is in the far north part of the West Bank, it's always has been a center of armed resistance to the occupation. And the Israelis hate Jenin. And Jenin is not a city, it's a refugee camp. That distinction needs to be made. The Jenin is a refugee camp composed of people who had lost their homes and were forcibly moved there by the Israelis, both in the late 40s and in 1967. So Jenin is a refugee camp. The armed resistance has always been strong. The Israelis hate them. And what the Palestinian Authority has done in order to show how much the Israelis can rely upon them, how willing they are as collaborators, and how you're going to need us in the future, is that they have been doing a lot of the fighting against the Palestinian armed resistance in Jenin, so much so that the Palestinian Authority has killed as many Palestinians in the West Bank in the last 15 months as Israeli settlers have. Nothing compares to the Israeli army. The Israeli army has killed hundreds and hundreds, and then they're in the process of doing so again now as they launch these operations. But that's something for people to really, I think people be shocked about, because you hear about the settlers, but you don't hear about the complicity, the collaboration, the role of the Palestinian Authority in all this. And
okay,
of course,
so now I've heard actually for years that a great many of the Palestinian people hated the Palestinian Authority for a number of reasons, right? And then, you know, there was some talk in the earlier part of this by the Biden administration. Well, maybe we need to put the Palestinian Authority in charge in the Gaza Strip after this is all over, et cetera. Some people said that. But the Hamas was always against Palestinian Authority, or at least they were in conflict a lot. And then now then, as the Wall Street Journal is talking about here, is that they have basically been, they have weathered all of this incredible amount of destruction that Gary was showing on the screen a second ago, and they are still a viable military and political entity. It just seems to me, and I don't have any knowledge about here, so I'm leaning on you for this. It just seems to me that their resilience under that kind of firepower to remain viable would elevate them even more in the eyes of regular Palestinians, and then diminish the Palestinian Authority even more down. So it seems like it would move the opposite direction among the Palestinian people. How do you see that dynamic playing?
I completely agree. When I was in Palestine a number of years ago, 2017, you talk to the Palestinians in the West Bank, and, they badmouth the PA, the Palestinian Authority, much more than they badmouth the Israelis, because they are the collaborators. And this is historical, right? I mean, occupied France, World War II, right? And you had the role, the collaborationist French government, the Vichy government, so much so. I just actually heard the other day, I can't remember if it was Jonathan Landis or Anatole Levin saying this, but the estimates are that between 10 and 20,000 French were executed after the war as collaborators. So when if you look at what was occurring with the resistance, the French resistance against the occupying Nazis, against the occupying Germans, very often the Germans themselves, of course, be fighting the resistance, but very, very often it was the French Vichy militias and the French police, under, of course, the orders of the German army and the Gestapo and so forth, who would do the fighting against the resistance. Right. Just actually watching a film that just came out on Netflix about the Norwegian resistance to the Germans in World War II, a film called Number 24. Good film. And but you see in that how the Norwegian resistance, they hate the collaborators more than they hate the occupiers. Right. And so I think you have that. And if people are familiar with what occurs in Gaza in 2006, 2007, when the U.S. and the Israelis essentially back a Palestinian Authority coup. Fatah is the name of the political party that makes up the PA. Back a coup in Gaza against Hamas. So, what occurs is Hamas wins the elections in Gaza, and then the United States and Israelis instigate a coup that Fatah leads, and they're defeated by Hamas. And Hamas, of course, takes control of Gaza at that point, and then says, we're not going to do elections anymore if this is what's going to happen. Well, I mean, so Fatah and the PA have always filled that role of collaborator as helper. And to your point, Danny, and like Gary is showing this video because it reminds me to say this, just what you were saying about the will of the Palestinian people, the resistance, the defiance that we saw on Sunday as these Israeli hostages were returned home to their families, the resistance there, the defiance, right? The samud, which is what the Palestinians often are referred to as the steadfastness after this genocide. Look how they responded. They see the ceasefire as a victory. And of course, that very much angers the Israelis. And of course, the Americans can't even stomach the thought of that showing up on American television, that what you're seeing here. So I'm sure the way the American television has showed those shots, that these are hordes of barbarians. These are all terrorists. Look at these people. Of course, we have to go back in there and bomb them. Of course, the ceasefire can't hold. The Israelis, of course, are just sickened at the thought that the Palestinians are viewing the ceasefire as a victory. It's a tool to use against Netanyahu to force a return back to violence, back to the genocide in Gaza. It's something we may or may not see, depending upon how serious the Israelis are about carrying out the annexation of the West Bank now. So the ceasefire.
And let me just ask you, just practically speaking, and just the last few minutes we have here, how logistically difficult would it be for Israel? Because Israel, I mean, one of the reasons I think they had to have this ceasefire against Hezbollah, they had to have a ceasefire here, is because their military was really starting to fray at the edges, because their military is not even designed for a long war. It's designed for short, sharp wars. That's why they have so many of the reservists that are kind of in and out. But now then they're trying to turn them all into active duty, and it's just ripping the seams off, it seems like, in a lot of things within Israel. So logistically, I don't know that they can keep going on like this for a long time. But what you're talking about here would be another escalation, especially into the West Bank, and essentially a new front on a war. Can they sustain that? Would international public opinion allow it?
It's difficult to see what the Israelis are going to do here, because, again, the West Bank has been the jewel. The West Bank has been their priority. That's what they really want. Even talking to Ben Gvir and Smotrich, they will say that is the priority. At the same time, too, you have the political reality in Israel is that many Israelis don't see the job in Gaza as being done, and particularly after the images coming out on Sunday, they will very much agree we have to go back in. I mean, so much that the Israeli cabinet, when they approved the ceasefire deal, they put on to the resolution approving the ceasefire deal that we will go back into Gaza. We will begin military operations again. We will reoccupy all of the Gaza Strip. We will take control of the humanitarian aid. So we'll start this all back over again. They can't do both Gaza and the West Bank at the same time. And so where they will go, we don't know. Politically, you see the benefit to Netanyahu with the ceasefire. He's able to claim that he's getting the hostages home, and he has it left open to him that, hey, we can start this back up again. That's essentially what he's going to need to do. Is Smotrich is serious about staying in the government, but it gives him a month or so, and he can play both sides of it, right? He's the guy who got back the hostages, and he's the guy who went back to war, because look at them. They're clearly not defeated. They clearly haven't learned their lesson. Now the Israeli military, of course, overstretched, whether it's the fact that the Lebanese, the ceasefire with Hezbollah expires in less than a week, the fact that they've taken more ground in Syria that they have to hold, the fact that there's an ever-present issue with the Iranians as well as the Yemenis. But then, what you've seen, Danny, I don't know if you saw that, the Israelis are going to create 5 new brigades for reservists, 38 to 58 years old. So bring in old men and old women. I could be in it. I think you're a little too old to make it in there. But the idea being, right, is like you've got these older reservists. You can have them manning checkpoints. You can have them driving trucks or doing whatever administrative type of a garrison-like activities you need to do. Or again, just manning checkpoints and perimeters. And we need the kids to be on the streets because they're the ones who have to kick in the door and shoot children and do what the IDF does. Right. So, but where the Israelis are going with this, I don't know, because they can go either way. You could the idea that they're going to allow the Palestinians back into northern Gaza, that goes against everything the Israelis have been trying to accomplish the last 6 months with the general's plan. They put a heck of a lot of effort, heck of a lot of resources, and with a vision of ethnically cleansing northern parts of Gaza to fulfill ambitions, political and Zionist ambitions in Israel. And now they're going to walk away from that? That seems really hard to believe. Yeah. At the same time, too, the clock's running. And they have 4 years under Trump to annex the West Bank. Who knows what's going to happen after that? So, where they go with this, I'm sure the discussions are very heated and very serious in Tel Aviv about what the next steps are. But I don't think they can do both. I don't think they can resume what they did in Gaza and also to carry out this annexation.
Yeah, it's just I think it's awful from the perspective of Israel itself. They are just digging themselves and their entire society deeper holes that are going to be harder and harder to get out. And these are just going to make it worse for everybody. And of course, I care most of all about the biggest victims in this, which is the Palestinian people. Right. But we'll just have to see what happens, and we'll keep tracking it in and keeping having you back on to help us make sense of it like you did today. Really appreciate all this.
Thanks, Danny.
And we appreciate you guys too. Always are grateful when you come and watch on our show. That's why we have them. We appreciate it because we are bringing you the truth, no matter what it is. We are unintimidated and uncompromised to make sure you get the right deal. Thank you very much. Do like and subscribe if you haven't done it on the way out. And we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.